Okay, everybody, we're going to start our panel part of the discussion. I'm going to introduce the three panelists that we have, and I'll be asking them some questions, but I would encourage them, if I don't ask the right question or they want to say something else, they should, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. We're really lucky to hear from all these people. I'm going to start over here with Tab Turner. Tab is a trial attorney who specializes in representing consumers injured by defective automotive products, environmental litigation, anti-terrorism litigation, and commercial litigation. Some of his cases have required him to pry public safety information not only from the hands of tight-fisted corporations, but ironically also from the government, which he found often works harder to protect corporate interests than consumer interests. Fair enough? He's credited as the pioneer in SUV safety issues, and it was largely through his efforts that Firestone pulled its defective tires off the market after a rash of Ford Explorer rollovers, leading to an estimated thousands of injuries and more than 100 deaths. The government and industry began all this by saying there were no problems with the tires or the rollover vehicles, and it was Tab that had evidence to prove them wrong. He's won verdicts for clients in multiple cases in excess of $20 million, including a $132 million jury verdict against Ford Motor Company relating to the death of poor Brian Cole, a young outfielder with the New York Mets organization, and that remains the largest single verdict in a wrongful death claim in the U.S. He was Outstanding Trial Lawyer of the Year in 2001 by Trial Lawyers for Public Justice, and he was recently part of a legal team that won a landmark lawsuit against Arab Bank on behalf of a large group of American Jews who were injured by Hamas terrorists on visits to Israel. Did I say that right? Were they all connected to Hamas? The lawsuits contend that the banks were breaking rules of international law by providing financial services to Hamas and related designated terrorist organizations. Tab also, his hardest job of all is representing me in a lawsuit against the federal government.
Amen.
For allegedly illegally infiltrating my work and home computers to monitor my work. Next in the middle here we have Ted Bridis. Ted leads the Washington, D.C. investigative team for Associated Press. He is regarded as AP's leading newsroom expert on freedom of information. His efforts won the $10,000 Eugene S. Pulliam First Amendment Awards in 2014 and 2011, among many other awards. His reporters won the Pulitzer and Goldsmith Prizes for investigative reporting in 2012 for coverage of NYPD intelligence programs, and they broke the story about the new Al-Qaeda airline plot in May 2012 to use a sophisticated new bomb designed to destroy a Western airliner. Ted, notably, I feel kindred spirits with you, was one of 6 AP journalists whose phone records the Justice Department seized in 2013 secretly during a subsequent leak investigation, which led to supposedly stronger press protections under new federal rules put into effect. Regarding the Hillary Clinton story, which I know a lot of people asked about today, Ted and another AP reporter were first to discover and trace Hillary Clinton's private email server to her home in Chappaqua, New York, which she used to conduct all her official government business when she was Secretary of State. He may talk a little bit about that. He's done many other things. He joined AP in '89 with a journalism degree from University of Missouri and worked in Oklahoma, Indiana, Kentucky before Washington, and also worked at the Wall Street Journal. Terry Anderson is our last panelist. He is a former foreign correspondent for Associated Press in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. He served as chief Middle East correspondent for the AP, as well as working as a newspaper editor, TV, radio reporter, and documentary producer. Now an adjunct professor here at UF, correct? He spent 10 years as a journalism professor at Syracuse, Ohio University, and Columbia School of Journalism before. He's author of the best-selling book, Den of Lions, recounting the 7 years he was held hostage by terrorists in Lebanon. He holds numerous awards in journalism. He's been involved in FOIA lawsuits about information the government kept secret about his own capture and their efforts to release him. In some instances, he has received copies as a result of his FOIA requests of published articles he himself wrote. That was the response he got. When he did get documents, they often contained large redactions. I'll let him tell you about one of the most outrageous claims the government made in denying his request as to what he would have to do to get more information. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to start. going to start with Terry and let each of them take a pretty short time, maybe just 2 minutes or so if possible, to give a little introduction of what you'd like to talk about, and then I'll ask questions, but some of your FOIA-related experience.
Sure. First thing I want to say is that what we're going through now may be the worst that we've seen ever, but it is nothing new. It's been going on for a long time. Almost 20 years ago, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a report on government secrecy, in which he noted that there are 6 million people in the United States who can stamp top secret on anything that they wish. And what he called a culture of secrecy had taken over our government. And I think 9/11 just furthered that culture. When I came home, obviously I was going to write a book. I mean, now, it's what you do, right? So I was given a one-year fellowship at the Freedom Forum, which was at Columbia Graduate School, to do that, to write a book. And they gave me an assistant secretary and all that. That was cool. And it was supposed to start in June, so I stopped by in March to see the director there, and I said, well, look, I got to put in a whole bunch of FOIA requests. And I've never done this before because, overseas they don't have FOIA. So, let's do that now. So when I come here in June, I'll have some stuff to work with. And he just laughed and said, yeah, you see, you've never done this before. So we put in FOIA requests to, a dozen or so letter agencies, CIA, FBI, NSA, all that kind of stuff, about Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, which was the name they used, 9 named individuals who already, after 4 months home, I had learned were members of the group that kidnapped me. It wasn't hard. I just asked other journalists. They knew. And we sent them off to Washington. And of course, when I got there in June, nothing had happened. So I started, pursuing my requests with, hey, sending letters, what happened? The first answer I got back was from the CIA. Some 5 or 6 months after I put it in. And it said, and this is not a joke, Dear Mr. Anderson, we can't give you this information because it would violate the Privacy Act. Okay, they're protecting the privacy of the terrorists, who are not American citizens, so they're not actually covered under the Privacy Act, but that's okay. Then I went on to say, however, if you can get signed, notarized releases from these people, we'll be glad to give you the information. And I was being helped by a wonderful law firm in Washington, pro bono, and the National Security Archives, which is a private group that pursues FOIA requests. We held a press conference, and we proudly displayed the CIA's answer in front of the Washington Press Corps. We all got a good giggle out of it. And Janet Reno, who was Attorney General at the time, went berserk and started, hunting people's heads and saying, you'll never, ever, 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 ever send anything like that again. And we went on. 4 years. Okay. Federal court in Washington assigned a special master, which is what they do, to go over the material to make a determination of whether it's properly classified or not. Over what turned out to be, in the end, I got a couple dozen big boxes of documents over the 4 years. Get a few, go back to court, argue some more, get some more, go back. We didn't let go. I mean, the lawyers were willing to stick with it, and stick with it, so we did. And when we finally ended and said, okay, I think we got pretty much everything we're going to get here, we had a couple dozen boxes of documents. Nothing in any of those boxes should have been classified. Nothing. There was nothing even really important in any of those boxes. Nothing. Copies of my story, stamped confidential, which had already appeared in 2,000 newspapers. The government runs a service which translates foreign news reports to English and distributes them to the embassy. We got boxes of those, all stamped secret. They'd already appeared in the news. That's how they got them. And a whole bunch of redacted documents. You'd have one line, black pages, and stuff like that. Absolutely ridiculous waste of everybody's time. Millions of dollars on the part of the government.
Which is Which is our money.
Yeah. 4 years worth of effort. And I swear, there was nothing in those boxes of documents that was properly classified. There were some interesting things. I got Ali North's diary, which gave the exact formula for how many weapons it took to get one hostage.
All right,
and,
so we'll come back to some more of that, but that's just an incredible story.
Worse. It's just gotten worse.
Yeah. Ted, do you want to give sort of an opening overview?
So last year, the government the good news is that the Freedom of Information Law, which is as close to a citizen subpoena as we get, is very popular, and more than ever. There were 714,000 requests made across the government last year. That was a record. It was a record the year before when it topped 700,000 for the first time. More people are using the Freedom of Information Law than ever before. Terry's exactly right. This is not a new problem, government manipulating and obfuscating responses under FOIA, but this administration has taken it to a whole new level, which is disappointing, especially because the promises from day one that they wouldn't do this. The redactions, the censoring of the documents. When you do get a document, it takes a long time. They're censored, and what we're finding increasingly is that they're improperly censored. We looked at the instances in which, as part of the process, most people don't know this, but when you get a response and it's censored, you can fight back. You can file an administrative appeal without having to go to court and basically just ask a new government officer to re-review the case, look at all the censoring, what's been withheld, whether that was proper. And in 42% of the instances across government, they reverse themselves. They find that, in fact, they had withheld material improperly. And at some agencies, like the Homeland Security Department, it's 68% of the time they get it wrong. 68% of the time. Only 2%, 3% of responses, of denials, get appealed. But if I'm not doing my job correctly 2 out of 3 times, how do you stay employed? So these are the frustrations that we're dealing with, and we can go into more detail shortly.
And Tab, I know that Tab has the job of trying to get information not just from corporations to the legal system, but also the government has sometimes partnered with these corporations, and instead of helping the cause of consumers, sometimes is helping the cause of the corporations and the secrecy.
I guess my poster child for freedom of information relates to the Arab Bank case. I represented and represent approximately 300 families who, over a 3-year period in the early 2000s, U.S. citizens were in Israel, either visiting or some of them were students going to school in Israel for the summer or for a semester. And they were victims in 24 separate terrorist attacks in various parts of Israel during that period of time. We had approximately 49 deaths, and the rest were either had shrapnel, lost limbs, brain injury, spinal cord injury, a variety of different. And the case was against Arab Bank for violating the Anti-Terrorism Act, which basically says that thou shalt not provide material support to known terrorist organizations, organizations that you have a reason to believe are involved in terrorism, or they're specially designated terrorist groups by OFAC, which is our Office of Foreign Asset Control here in the U.S. And during the course of the litigation, it went on for 7 years. We tried the liability portion this past summer, and a jury in Brooklyn found the bank responsible for all 24 attacks. And we go back and start this next summer on 6 separate damage trials associated with each of those attacks. But during the course of this, we learned that there was a committee formed by the Saudis called the Saudi Committee in Support of the Intifada al-Quds. Intifada means uprising, and these attacks all occurred during what's referred to in the Middle East as the Second Intifada, which was the second uprising of the Palestinians. and the Palestinians were basically primarily Hamas, but also Hezbollah, were involved in many of these attacks in Israel. And we learned that the Saudi committee during the Second Intifada had transferred over $100 million to Hamas. This is money that had been collected through Muslim and Islam charitable organizations across the globe, and then funneled ultimately through the Saudi committee, and then funneled to Arab Bank by way of Arab Bank located on Madison Avenue in New York. And as a consequence, after our lawsuit was filed, the federal government began an investigation into Arab Bank and ultimately closed down the branch in New York, shut them down completely, and seized over $300 million worth of their assets in the United States. And during the course of that investigation, we learned that they also investigated the Saudi committee. So about 6 years before trial, we served a Freedom of Information Act on OFAC, asking them to provide to us any investigation materials, any materials whatsoever they had relating to the Saudi committee.
What's OFAC, Tab?
OFAC is the Office of Foreign Asset Control,
So federal government.
part of the Treasury Department. And 6 years, and it just so happened, the day after trial, we finally got a response to our Freedom of Information Act request. And during the entire trial, which was a 2-month trial in New York, the bank was taking the position, Arab Bank was taking the position that the federal government had cleared the Saudi committee of any involvement in terror finance. And the day after the trial is over, the government released to us their Freedom of Information response and said basically, we don't have any documents, but we did conduct an investigation, and we did find that they were involved in financing terrorism. And so that's my poster child for how valuable in the present environment we live in today that the Freedom of Information Act is. And there are many other instances in the automotive industry, for instance, with the volume of recalls that we've all seen in the last several years, much less the last decade, involving the government and the lack of support the government provides to the ordinary consumer, when all the ordinary consumer is interested in finding out is, what do you know? You, our government, know about these defects, and what information are you acquiring from the lobbyists and from the automotive industry with respect to these defects and these vehicles that we're putting our children in?
Just a quick follow-up. Do you suspect that the federal government intentionally gave you the response when it was no longer any good to you after you'd done your whole trial the next day, or was that just weird, bad timing after 7 years?
Well, I think the question answers itself.
So what would be their motivation to not help you and provide the response to the question, answer the question?
The government's not interested in helping me. The government's not interested in helping anybody sitting on this stage right now. The government, what I see in my everyday profession is I see a government that is there. Well, the revolving door is probably the best example, and this is in the context of automotive safety. We have a National Highway Traffic Safety Administration whose sole goal in life is to protect the ordinary consumer when it comes to automotive safety in this country. Every director after Joan Claybrook, every director of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has gone to work for the automotive industry. And that's why they call it a revolving door at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The most recent example, I don't know if there's a station called CVN. Has anybody heard of CVN? It's Courtroom Video Network. It's on the internet. And they broadcast nowadays for, I think, $5 or $10 or something like that a day. Certain trials across the country. It's sort of like it used to be Court TV. But this is now called CVN. There's a trial that just began a couple of days ago in Georgia. It's called Walden versus Chrysler, and it has to do with the Chrysler pickup SUVs and pickup trucks being hit from the rear, and the gas tank is located rear of the rear axle. In other words, behind the rear axle, which is literally unheard of in this country since the Pinto. Literally unheard of. And NHTSA has been fighting with Chrysler for the last 2 years, 3 years, over recalling all of those vehicles. And it seems like every 6 months Chrysler agrees to recall another 200,000 vehicles. In the meantime, they fight with them over that. There's a young child that burned up in a Chrysler Jeep Cherokee. And the trial just began 2 days ago, and I was watching a clip of it on courtroom video yesterday. And the now chairman, who used to be chairman of Fiat, but now, since Fiat has bought Chrysler, was deposed in the case. And this is an example of what we deal with on a daily basis with respect to our government. There's the ongoing investigation of Chrysler. Sergio Marchionne, who's the CEO of Fiat, and ultimately Fiat, what's called Fiat Chrysler America now, FCA, calls or has somebody call the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And at that time, I think it was David Strickland. And calls and sets up a meeting. David Strickland, the head of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, gets on an airplane in Washington, goes to the UPS building in Detroit, Michigan, meets with Sergio Marchionne. And the message to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was, we don't want any associates, nobody else, just you and Sergio are going to meet. They meet. A deal is worked out not to recall any more vehicles because there weren't any more recall. David Strickland leaves 6 months later and goes to the law firm that earns over $50 million a year lobbying for Chrysler. And Sergio Marchionne, under oath, testifies that that was never discussed at the meeting in Detroit. That's the kind of thing we face in my profession on a daily basis in this country. And that's just one example.
So Tab said he had problems with OFAC 6 years, and then they released it after the trial. We had a request pending with OFAC for information about companies that had been engaged with trade with Iran. In spite of the sanctions, most people don't know that you can actually, there are some excluded categories of commerce that American companies can engage in with Iran. They just have to get a special license through the Treasury Department. And we just recently got our latest batch of documents, and it was 9 years later. And almost every page was completely blacked out.
In reference to the Saudi committee, there is no way the U.S. government is going to help anybody attack the Saudis. They are still under the misapprehension, despite all evidence, that the Saudis are our allies.
Ted most recently did a story, I didn't mention in his introduction, investigating the office expense account and private business deals with political donors of Illinois Congressman Aaron Schock, who resigned and is now under federal criminal investigation. Can you tell us a little bit about that and about, especially as it relates to maybe how you got information? And you probably didn't use FOIA because it's Congress, or did you use FOIA, but how you got what you needed?
Yeah, we didn't use FOIA in that case. Exactly right. It's not, Congress is exempt, as is most of the White House is exempt. There are some ways you can get records that congressmen exchange with executive agencies, but we didn't in this case. In this case, we used his own sort of hubris and his Instagram account. So,
well, for those who don't know the story, what's the brief?
So Congressman Schock is one of the youngest members of Congress, the only member of Congress, I think, who was born in the 80s, 33 or 34, very fit young man, rising star in the Republicans. Has a sort of a mid-level manager's position, senior deputy whip, I think. Has Abraham Lincoln's congressional seat, and likes to travel extensively. Went to see the Pope, has gone overseas, and documents many of his travels using his Instagram account, and in the past he had mentioned that, in fact, he's the only one who controls his Instagram account on his phone. So one of my really brilliant reporters, we downloaded his Instagram stream and extracted from Instagram the metadata associated with the GPS coordinates of each photo as it was being uploaded at the time, and then cross-referenced that with flight records of the planes and helicopters owned by Aaron Schock's top donors. And we were able to lay them out and find that, in fact, the congressman was flying on donor planes and billing it as commercial travel, even though they were private flights. At the time, you were not allowed to do that. So The Economist, we got a lot of credit for that story. Jack deserved every bit. The Economist called it an ingenious technique. He's now under federal grand jury investigation, as we reported. His staff is being subpoenaed as we speak. And so, this is one of the kind of speak truth to power that Sharyl talked about. Very important in Washington. And since I've got a room full of aspiring college journalists, let me just plead with you the message that we beat the drum at the AP. Please eschew access journalism. Do not trade your integrity for the occasional handout from the public relations office in government. It is never worth it. It is never worth it. Do not put yourself at the mercy of the public affairs staff. Always dig deeper. Find the true decision makers inside government, whether it's a federal agency, a state, or a local office. Get to the chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff, or the deputy assistant secretary who is actually maneuvering the operations of the government. Get to know them. Set up whatever, as I've had my phone records subpoenaed, whatever secret communications channels you need to establish to avoid detection. Protect these people professionally. Buy them a burner phone. Use out-of-channel communications, out-of-band communications, whatever it takes. But do not put yourself at the mercy of the public affairs staff, because you're not doing journalism.
Terry,
Tell us the truth. How much did you enjoy that shop story? I mean, come on, you got some giggles out of it.
Those stories are always a lot of fun.
Terry, what year was it that you were seeking this information for the book?
92, 93, 94, 95, early 90s.
So all this time has passed, with things getting probably worse, not better. Are you surprised we haven't risen up and done something about it, for lack of a better
I'm amazed why we aren't really pissed off. All of us. I blame the industry as much for accepting this as I blame the Obama administration for doing it. Yeah, go ahead, sir. You want to?
I have a brief comment, and then I'll let any panelists comment on it. But I talk about in Stonewall, if you read it, this would be right up your alley. There's just this mentality among many in the news media now that avoids not just certain partisan issues. In some cases, that is the case, but tends to want to avoid controversies altogether, especially if everybody's not doing it. There's safety in numbers. They don't want to be out there and alone on something. What we call pushback has never been so well organized as it is now, where special interests, political interests, and so on hire PR firms that get law firms that do social media and orchestrate things on Wikipedia, Facebook, Twitter, bloggers, Media Matters, Talking Points Memo, one after the other, to create this reality of opposition against a story and against a news organization or against journalists if they pursue a story. And all that has led to so many in the media, in my view, just kind of seizing up and not wanting to pursue these stories, because after all, what's in it for you? There's really no rainbows, as I like to say, or pot of gold at the end of the day for reporters who do that kind of work, especially if your bosses become slightly uncomfortable with it and nobody likes it, the powers that be that don't like it, and you're being hit with all the social media attacks and the bloggers, sometimes then getting picked up by regular news media. you really have to be dedicated to the job to keep beating your head against the wall and trying to do it, and people do. But
2 points. Number one, how do you know about all those things?
Well,
Okay, let's not discuss Benghazi here. That's a political thing.
From media, but not from the drive by media. That's correct.
You heard it from people like the AP and the New York Times
No.
and other good media who have reported all these things. And if they're not arousing the country to rebellion, why are you blaming the media? They are reporting it.
Richard Nixon, when he just broke
The American public didn't overthrow Richard Nixon. Congress did.
well, but it was the citizens that were up in arms about it.
Okay, but you're talking about a golden age that's 50 years ago. Let's talk about today.
Well,
and media
and
today.
there were 3 networks, and there were a handful of national newspapers, and now it's a vastly diluted media, infrastructure now.
Is that diluted or diluted?
Yeah, a little of both.
Sorry.
It really is. We can break a big story, pursue it, and Fast and Furious, and Benghazi, and I have reporters, colleagues at the AP in Washington who commit significant parts of their lives to these stories and report them very aggressively, despite a lot of pushback. And we're very fortunate at the AP to have bosses that stand up for us, that take the calls from the press office at the White House. I've been asked to come over and in the old executive office building and told that your coverage on this is making us look bad, and I just sort of shrug. Yeah. The stimulus. We wrote about the economic stimulus, and the vice president's office was very, very upset about that. We were reporting that you're spending money to repair bridges that don't need to be repaired, and the bridges that actually do need to be repaired are not being repaired. So we kept pointing out these sort of fallacies of the problem. People's attention spans are a lot more spread thin these days. It's harder to get traction on even a really significant what we would consider a political scandal. I don't know how Watergate would play today. It's a really interesting question.
Well, we also, excuse me 1 second, Terry. There are 2 things that have changed during the course of my lifetime. One is the 24-hour news cycle that we have now didn't exist back then. Now, today, everything is immediate. Remember the days where we had carbon copy paper and the typewriter, and then it changed to faxes, and now it's the internet where, I can't deal with the number of emails I get every day. I have to have people that deal with the emails before I have to deal with the emails. It's gotten immediate. And as a consequence, I think we have saturated the ordinary person. You can sit there and watch CNN for, 12 minutes, and then the cycle begins again, and you watch the same show, and everybody's just glazed-eyed and watching the same thing, and they're hearing the same news story over and over again until 2 hours later they realize, well, I've seen this before. So, they get up and move somewhere else. And the other thing that I think has, at least in my lifetime, has altered the course of where we are today is that corporate America, and this is touched on in Sheryl's book, corporate America has decided to infiltrate and take over journalism to a very large degree. And corporate America has moved in and now controls with the magic wand what the investigators that followed, Watergate and did those kinds of things, they're not given the freedom to do that anymore in many instances. And as a consequence, I think we all suffer because those people, the Sharyl Attkissons of the world, who were given the opportunity to dig and not do, okay, here's a story, it's going on the air in, 2 hours? They don't, you do a superficial job when you're given that short of time, when you're given the ability and the freedom to work over a long period of time. And long in the course of journalism is a day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, to really investigate a story, and you're given the freedom to do what they did with Watergate. There's nobody better in the world than U.S. journalists to bring out the truth in those circumstances.
Can I, we can continue commenting, or this is a good time, if anybody else has questions, we should fit those in for any of our panel members. Yes, ma'am.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned that when you submit many people, when they submit a request and it's denied, there is a few percentage of people who then follow up and submit an administrative appeal. Why do you think that is? Is it maybe the common person doesn't understand?
Yeah, I think it's a lack of awareness. I think it's a hassle. You have to go figure out how to construct an administrative appeal and how to do it successfully, what legal arguments you can make. It doesn't require a lawyer, but it helps to be able to consult, other administrative appeals, or
You have to deal with
consult a
lawyers.
lawyer. We have
That's a
great
big problem.
We have great lawyers at the AP who I can call on, and of course we've been doing a lot of FOIA work in Washington in our bureau. So, but yeah, I think that's what it is. The biggest problem is that it automatically adds 3 to 5 months to the process.
Well, and beat reporters are busy. That's a time-consuming. At CBS, we didn't have as many resources as Ted's talking about. Not that I'm saying you're overrun with resources, but we didn't have a system that helped with FOIA. So who's going to do that? You just have to do that on your own time when you're very busy between other stories. And I was wondering if Terry, in the end, the documents you got, you didn't think were particularly helpful. Do you feel like you got all the documents you should have gotten in the end? And if not, what else? Was there just nothing more you could do?
What we were winning every argument before the court, but we were arguing about a progressively smaller pool of documents at issue. And after 4 years, it came to the point where we said, okay, we've carried this about as far as we can, and we're going to let the rest of the documents go, because maybe they do have a legitimate reason for keeping those secret. We are, after all, dealing with terrorist organizations and things like that. So, yeah, there may be some legitimate reason for that, and we just simply stopped. Some of the stuff is interesting. None of it had a real justification for being secret. None of it. Some of it was mildly embarrassing. We got some embassy telegrams that were commenting less than positively about people like Hafez Assad and others, which would be embarrassing for the State Department. But embarrassment doesn't come under the secrecy rules,
Well,
I just think it does.
It did in a case that we had last year, where one of our reporters was actually looking into who pays for Michelle Obama's expensive dresses. And so she had diligently, bless her, filed FOIA requests with the National Archives, where many of the First Lady's dresses are subsequently stored after she wears them. And we got back some responsive documents, and they were censored, redacted. And they redacted the same passage in the same email thread in every copy, except for one page they forgot to redact the sentence. And they had redacted it under the B6 exemption, which is for personal privacy. So this is to protect people's phone numbers, their email addresses, or their social security numbers. That's not supposed to be disclosed publicly. And the sentence that they had forgotten to redact in this case was, "We live in constant fear of upsetting the White House." And so this is what we're up against. It was plainly, improperly redacted. And if we had appealed, they just forgot to redact it in one instance. But if we had appealed, we probably would have won on that case. We had a case this week, actually, where we had been investigating the number 2 official at Homeland Security involving a visa scandal in the department. And back in July of 2013, we had filed requests. About 7 months later, we got 200 pages, very heavily censored. But strangely enough, we could still sort of, make out what the pages were about. And strangely enough, they were all exculpatory toward the official. He wasn't getting involved in the process improperly. Well, this week, the Inspector General at the agency came out with a 99-page report that was very damaging and devastating toward this official about the instances in which he did get improperly involved in 3 deals involving Hillary Clinton's brother, Terry McAuliffe, who's now the Democratic governor of Virginia, Ed Rendell, the former Democratic governor of Pennsylvania. So basically, Democrats helping Democrats. And the Inspector General's report quoted and cited some of the emails that had been turned over to us as part of our FOIA, but strangely enough, also cited a lot of emails that curiously never made it to us that should have. I mean, we went back and looked at the way we had phrased the FOIA request. Those incriminating statements should have been turned over as well, and they weren't. And so these are the shenanigans that we're facing, and it's a head pounding, exasperating exercise.
You should know that the FOIA law has some specifics in it. They have specific deadlines for answering the first request, which are almost universally ignored. They have specific deadlines, reasonable deadlines, for handling an appeal, which are almost universally ignored. It requires, you can't simply take a document and say, can't have it, it's secret. See? And you can't redact it, just black it out. You have to cite the content of the document and the specific information that should be kept secret. And if it's a half a sentence, that's all you get to do under the law. And you have to give a specific reason. They never do. They never cite anything more than a vague, like you said, 2B something or other. When you take it to court, if you do get a court suit, and the special master, the first thing he does is go back to the agency and say, okay, all of these denials do not comply with the law. Take them back, give us a master index of all the redactions you've made, and comply with the law. Say specifically what you're redacting and specifically why you're redacting it. And that's where you begin. Now you have some idea of what you're actually missing.
We also see the improper redaction show up when the material is turned over to us under the Freedom of Information Law, but then subsequently Congress starts nosing around and investigating, and then they get the documents. And of course, they're not allowed to apply FOIA redactions when they turn over documents under subpoena to Congress. And if a sympathetic congressman or his chief of staff will give you a copy of the document in unredacted form, then it's really always very interesting to sit down and line them up and see what they redacted and what should never have been redacted. And that's very common. Let me just say, we're in a room in a journalism school. So, I mean, the expedited processing, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but under the law, they are required to move us to the head of the line whenever we can justify it's a breaking news story, and it shows the resulting documents will show the operations of the government, and we can affirm and attest that in fact, we're a news organization. And what's really very frustrating is the frequency with which the administration is turning down our requests to be moved to the head of the line, which they're required to do under the law. 5 years ago, about half the time they would move us to the front of the line on a breaking news story, and that made it plausible to use the Freedom of Information Act in breaking journalism. Now it's 14% of the time is when we get approved. Every other time it gets requested. The CIA has turned down every single request for expedited processing in the last 2 years. Every single request. And recently, they bragged about how quickly they adjudicate the decision on whether to grant expedited processing. They actually said in a document, it only takes us 7 days to decide whether to grant expedited processing. Yes, that's because you say no every single time. I mean, it shouldn't take you 7 days. It should take you 7 minutes.
Okay, young lady here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the overarching problem
Ted, do you worry, especially once you found out the government had secretly seized was it your personal phone records as well as your professional?
Yeah, they got my cell phone, my work cell phone, my home cell phone, my home number, and my work number. And they got it over a period of 21 days, I think. And so every single person, every single source I had a conversation with during that 21 days, their information was now in the hands of the Justice Department. And it took, and they didn't just get mine, they got 5 other journalists specifically, and then they went after 20 of our sort of general phones. So they got the main switchboard for the Washington Bureau. For 21 days, every journalist at the AP in Washington had a conversation with their source, and those sources' personal information, names, where they worked, showed up in the Justice Department's hands.
And were you worried about?
I was very worried. And in fact, we had sources dry up. We had, for a year, I had reporters on the National Security Beat who were covering CIA and intelligence issues. who just found it very difficult to do the jobs that they were doing. We ended up diverting over to do a story about steroids in college football, just to basically, spend some time and divert attention onto something else. And then, before we went back to covering aggressively the intelligence community.
Tab, do you have concerns, maybe not just as a result of FOIA, but you do work that the government clearly doesn't want you to do, and you did your terrorism case that terrorists didn't want you to do? Do you change your lifestyle?
After I started representing you, I really became concerned. It's one thing to be involved in litigation with people that live in the Middle East. It's another to take on the FBI and the CIA and the Attorney General of the United States.
Can I point out, in case people are wondering, that do you mind me saying what your political affiliation is?
No, not at all.
So Tab is a what? Prominent Democrat.
I'm a Clintonite.
He's a Clintonite, so he's
I'm
helping.
from Arkansas, so
He's helping me because it's the right thing, not because of any ideology, obviously, that he has politically.
Yeah, when I was growing up, there was no such thing as a Republican in Arkansas. You were either a conservative Democrat or a liberal Democrat. And in any event, circling back to your question, yeah, in terms of what I do, at least in the context of Sharyl's situation, I just assume that somebody's listening or somebody's reading everything. And as a consequence, you just have to, we talk more in person than we do. We don't talk strategy. Certain things I'll send her an email every once in a while just to tell her something that I know is not true. Just, for the purpose of sending her an email to, and she'll call me and she'll go, "What was that about?" And I'll go, "Oh yeah, that was about that." And she'll go, "Oh, okay." And you just have to accept it.
It's called a dangle.
Big Brother is watching us and they're listening to us and they're doing all of that. I never really worried about that aspect of it. Now, when we went to, we took a lot of depositions in Jordan, and when we were in Amman, just assumed that, if you hooked into the Wi-Fi at the Four Seasons Hotel in Amman, that you were hooking directly into, the Arab Bank government version of the CIA, because Arab Bank is owned 40% by the government of Jordan. So as a consequence, I assumed everything I said or did was being listened to. So, but over here, I don't worry about that as much.
The flip side of what happened to us was that the technologies have evolved, and particularly among news organizations, we're very much more aware of encrypted phone services, encrypted text messaging, encrypted emails. So, I mean, as a young aspiring journalist, absolutely, you ought to become familiar with ways to not leave phone records that can be subpoenaed. You want to be using phone services with your sources in ways that don't leave a breadcrumb trail. But I would be remiss we talk about, personal safety and personal risk. I mean, what our reporting on sensitive issues makes it very professionally inconvenient, but nothing like what Terry went through. Nothing like
all
what
international journalists are going through now.
Yeah. I mean, we're not
This
being
is the most
murdered.
dangerous period we've ever had in international journalism, by far. And the rules have changed completely. But that's another subject. I wanted to ask you guys, maybe you can answer this question about this FOI situation in general. I mean, it's getting dangerous to the point where it's damaging our democratic system. We can no longer hold our leaders responsible for anything they do. Even the courts have said we can't hold them responsible. So my question is, why are we not reacting as an industry? Why are we not banding together to, for instance, file suits against the Supreme Court saying the president is not allowed to do this, it's against the law? Why are we not doing this? Some people are reacting. The AP does well. Your Jacksonville paper does a lot of FOIA stuff, but it's individual. The threat is not individual. The threat is to our entire system of government.
I think, and this is just my view, but I think we're we as a society are grappling with this issue and have been for some time. I think Florida's Sunshine Law is a perfect example. In Florida, which was one of the leading states in terms of creating a sunshine in litigation law, it doesn't work. It's a great thought that doesn't work. And here's my personal experience on why it doesn't work. Let's say I've got a case against Ford Motor Company here in Florida, and it's a huge consumer safety issue. The big push right off the bat is going to be they're going to want confidentiality on everything. Well, if I challenge the confidentiality, which I do, then that means the media has to be notified, and there has to be a public safety hearing, and the judge has to review the documents alleged to be confidential. All right, that's step one. Step two is Ford Motor Company comes in with a Ryder warehouse truck with 300 boxes of documents, and you've got a judge who has 462 cases on his docket. And the judge under the Sunshine Law has to review those documents and decide what is truly confidential and what is not confidential. You can imagine how happy the judge is when I walk in the room and find out we're going to have a public safety hearing, and he's going to have to begin looking at 400 boxes of documents. Well, the first thing he does is he says, okay, before we have our public safety hearing, you guys go over in the room over there and don't come out until you get this resolved. And I'm in the position now, I've got a client who in most cases is either dead or in a wheelchair that cannot afford for me to waste the next 6 months litigating over an issue of confidentiality. And so now I'm put in the dilemma of, do I just concede and say, okay, treat them all as confidential, and then look at them and fight it later on down the road, that's the expeditious thing to do, that's the efficient thing to do. And what always happens is when it comes time to fight that down the road, you've gone far enough in the case where they start writing your client a check and the information never becomes public. And in exchange for the check, they want confidentiality as to the amount of the settlement and the terms of the settlement, and the documents have to be returned. And the problem we have in the legal arena is there is no reasonable fix to that. In the FOIA world, in the federal government world, a special master can be appointed. In Florida, the parties have to agree that a special master can be appointed. If one of the parties, for instance, if Ford goes, no, we're not going to agree to a special master, well, that means the judge has to do it, which means it's just not going to happen. In the practical, real world, it's just not going to happen. It's a beautiful idea that is not working. Well, how do we fix it? It's fun talking about the problems, but how do we fix all of this? Well, we don't fix this unless Congress fixes it, but the biggest broken piece of machinery in the country is Congress. And it's never going to get fixed in the current situation it is right now, in my view.
We're going to pick up the discussion tomorrow because part of why we're doing this is I know we're just a small group of people, but we know people who know people, and we're going to try to talk about why the lack of outrage and how we can get together in a bigger group and do something that might be meaningful. I want to give Terry like the last minute or two. We've got to wrap up, but
I've got something I just want to offer you. I've been working for 20 years with the Committee to Protect Journalists. I'm the honorary chair these days. I don't know how many of you know about the organization. It is a marvelous group that monitors attacks on the press around the world and defends journalists under attack and does a very good job of it. They also lobby on press issues. And they have recently started what they call a digital right to report. And I want to read to you what our executive director says about that very quickly. With journalists around the world being killed, kidnapped, and murdered in record numbers, why is the Committee to Protect Journalists launching a campaign targeting U.S. government policies? The answer is simple: because we must fight to preserve a global system on which independent and critical journalism depends. Journalism today lives online. The ability to post, share, and communicate across borders is what defines the current era. This ability also threatens powerful forces, including autocratic governments and militant groups and corporations, that reject critical scrutiny. Many have lashed out at the media, and repression of journalists around the world has increased as a result. Let's be clear. Journalists in the U.S. face limited physical risks, and with the very notable exception of James Risen, few are confronting the prospect of jail. But the threat to independent reporting is real. And what happens in the U.S. has a tremendous impact on global media. He's talking about three areas: the chilling effect of pervasive surveillance, the aggressive campaign to hunt down government leakers, which has ensnared reporters, and the existence of a civil liberties dead zone on the U.S. border, in which officials are free to search journalists' laptops and other work. Did you know that? Whenever you cross the U.S. border, they have an absolute right to confiscate your laptop and search it. And anything else you may be carrying. You have no appeal. We are in a very serious situation in this country right now. We are losing our rights, the rights we've maintained. Journalism, as a part of our society, has fought for 250 years to protect. And we're losing them. And nobody's pissed off. Nobody is gathering together to march in the street or gathering the industry together to say, no, we're not going to let this happen. And that's something that I really don't understand. That's something we have to do. We have to stop accepting, shaking our head and saying, gee, that's really terrible, and do something.
And along those lines, I think we should all be worried about, at least I'm concerned about, Google's announced plan to make software that will filter out for you as a favor and only show you the sites at the top that it deems to be the most reliable and truthful. Through some form, they're going to troll websites and take out ones that have facts they disagree with. So this would have been decades ago. If people thought cigarettes caused cancer, that would be wiped out because science was settled. Conventional wisdom said cigarettes didn't cause cancer. So you wouldn't find that on the web because those facts are wrong, right? I mean, it depends on who's filtering them out. And if you trust Google and whatever political influences act upon Google or corporate influences act upon Google to decide for you what you should get to see and what's truthful and reliable, then this wouldn't bother you. But I personally don't think that's a great idea. Thank you so much to Ted, and Terry.